Hello, my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Dream Big Quilt Along. This week, we're quilting Pinstripe Matrix with the Super Slide and Mini Slide rulers. So let's jump on the machine and learn how this works with ruler foot quilting. So this is Pinstripe Matrix. It is created with any curving ruler. So I've been playing with the mini slide, and you can see that this makes a very subtle curve. It's very shallow, but I love that how it kind of echoes the petal shape and emphasizes that. And the smaller ruler, I can definitely say, is a little bit easier to handle on your home sewing machine. And that's why I'm going to demo this pedal using the Super Slide ruler. It's bigger, it's clunkier, and that makes it just a little bit more challenging, but at the same time, it's good to see that it still works. It's just a little bit on the long side. So here we go. I'm in this little pedal here in the center, and I want this line to curve out and then come and hit right at the tip. And this is just me being a little bit persnickety on where it lands out. It doesn't have to land here. This is just my own desire for having it set the stage at this spot. And so when I want something to land, like I want the line to land in an exact spot, I need to make sure that the ruler is positioned a 1/4 inch away. So I'm taking into account the 1/4 inch provided by the foot. And this also nicely curves the side of the petal shape too. I like that. So this looks good. The one thing I have noticed is that the center of the petal can be very squishy. We've already done our outline quilting, we've done our echoing, and then as I've been doing more quilting of the quilt, where I haven't quilted, those areas get a little bit spongy almost, and it becomes just a little bit even more challenging to control. So I have found really spread out your hands, slow, steady push, get to about halfway through the ruler, about right there, and there's lines etched on these rulers to show you the halfway point. Stop at that stage, reposition your hands, and that way you can keep on going and have really good control. Because when the fabric is squishy, then it can shift and wiggle around on you and be really challenging. There we go, we got our first line. Okay, so now I'm going to travel stitch over to the right by a 1/4 of an inch. And I think that this is a great scale to go with no matter if you are stitching a jacket or you're making a fluffy quilt. I think that this is going to be a really nice scale. It's going to really stand out. You're going to first do 1/4 inch spacing. Here I stitched over a 1/4 inch. I'm lining up the ruler so that the side of the ruler is lined up right with that line of stitching. And this is behind the machine, and this is basically blocked. I can't really see back behind here. So I'm leaning over my body slightly. I'm pressing that ruler firmly down as I steer and pull the quilt, making sure that the ruler foot stays in contact with that ruler. That's the trickiest thing with a home sewing machine. You know, on a long arm, we're pulling the machine against the ruler. Well, here we're pulling the quilt and the ruler against the foot. So it's a fundamentally different feel, but it definitely works. You just have to keep in mind that the ruler and the foot have to stay in connection in order to get that beautiful, nice curve. All right, I'm going to travel stitch just a bit because I'm nicely building up the edges of my petal shapes just so that way they look really pretty. There we go. And I'm travel stitching over so that my edge of my foot is a 1/4 inch from the line I just stitched. And then now I'm going to do a 1/2 inch spacing. So it's 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch. That's how you line up and create any sort of pinstripe effect. And really, ideally, you would leave even more space in the wider spacing, like 3/4 of an inch. That looks great too, but I found that was just a little bit too wide for this particular project. I really wanted this to be quilted on a denser scale when I tried it to be a little wider. If you're making a quilt though, this wider spacing could be wider. You could make that 3/4 of an inch or an inch wide. That would be a-okay. So now I'm going to do my 1/4 inch spacing again. So the pattern is you go narrow and then wide and then narrow again, and that creates this really cool effect. And pretty much what I found, especially when I'm pulling away from myself, I can't really see back here. It's good to stop about every 3 inches or so check yourself, reposition, and then sometimes, I'm correcting a little bit. Sometimes I'm moving that ruler just a little bit with the tips of my fingers as I'm stitching down, and that's okay. Just don't let it slip completely out of position. Now travel stitching over. I want to show you what it looks like if you're going with a wider spacing. You would just simply position, keep stitching over, and then shift the ruler so that one of these straight lines is lined up with the depth of that curve. So you can definitely use the super slide or mini slide ruler for deeper curves. That's a-okay. And once you get to the really big petals, you might use, you need to use a longer, it might need to feel like it needs to be even longer, but just understand that if you stop a 1/4 inch from the end of the ruler, that's going to match up down here. And also it's the same curve on both sides. So if you get down here and it doesn't feel right, you can always flip it around and be stitching from right here. That's the nice thing. So let me just illustrate that. This curve now, you see how that lines up just absolutely perfectly. That's the same exact curve. A lot of curving rulers that are on the market, they don't have the same curve on both sides. They use 2 different curves. They maybe have like a shallow curve on one end and a deeper curve on the other end. That's really not all that helpful because you have situations like this where you need to match up and stitch with one side, or that gets a little awkward, so you flip it around. You need the same curve on both sides of the ruler. So there we go, travel stitch. It's just an optional thing. I'm just building up thread. I just like the look of it. And having put together a good part of my jacket now, I know how funky that looks on the jacket itself. And I'm even tempted to go in and do a little bit of thread couching and stuff, maybe some decorative silver threads or something. I don't know. It's kind of a whole rabbit hole of decorating it up a little bit more, but I know already I have so much hand stitching to finish on that, so I kind of have to be careful what I bite off enough and be able to chew it and get it done. All right, so here we go. I've only got a few more lines to stitch. I think I just have maybe one more set of pinstripes. Again, this is our wider spacing. And this is an example of what can happen, just the squishiness of the fabric here. Now, that curve is not, the edge lines on the ruler are basically not lining up with what I've stitched before. That's okay. Just line it up as close as you can get it, and just understand that you might have a little bit of a wider spacing, a little bit of a wider gap in some spaces. That's okay. It's not the end of the world. No one's going to notice. No one's going to take a ruler to your quilt and check that all the spaces are exactly the same. It's not a big deal. It's just the nature of, as you put more quilting on your quilt and it starts to get stable in some areas, like over here, this is stable, this area is stable, this area is stable, those areas kind of start to feel different. And then the areas that are not stable tend to feel very loosey-goosey, and that can affect the placing of your ruler on the quilt, and then that, of course, can then affect, how well everything spaces out perfectly. Okay, so we've stitched our lines. I think you understand the placement. The pinstripe effect comes in of having the 2 lines spaced a 1/4 inch apart. You can widen the wider space. So I have a 1/2 inch here in the wider space. You could go 3/4 of an inch, 1 inch, 2 inches, totally up to you how wide that spacing becomes. But especially in smaller areas like this, you're going to want to keep it fairly small just so you can see the texture. If you start getting really, really wide spacing, you're going to lose it's not going to be enough lines on the quilt to be able to see what you're trying to stitch there. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, understand that you could widen this out if you prefer it. I really like this if you're going to do a jacket. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch spacing, and that creates that nice curving pinstriped effect. And that, you could just stitch that in some of the petals and leave it there. But I want to go on ahead and double this. And as you can see, this requires a little bit of a rotation. Again, as with all of our other ruler designs, plan it out, figure out how you can begin so that you can use the ruler on the outside of the machine versus trying to cram it in here into this number, right? Although, let me show you exactly how that's going to look, how that's going to work. If that happens to you, what do? Well, I'm going to squish around first. I'm going to go on ahead and travel stitch down just a bit. Actually, no, you know what? I'm going to make myself stay in this rather tricky spot just to show you. And what we're going to do is get the ruler into a nice position. I kind of like the curve to go like this, and more of the ruler is now to the back. So I have to watch the bulk here in the back so it doesn't get lipped up. There we go. That feels right. And so whenever I'm just getting stuff set up for ruler quilting, I'm checking in. I'm feeling the quilt. I'm feeling all around it. I'm feeling under the ruler. My fingertips are taking on a lot of information here just to tell me what's going on with the quilt and to make sure that when I hit my foot pedal and I start pushing, it's going to go well and it's not going to just kind of be a mess, you know? Slow, steady push. And slow, steady foot pressure on the foot pedal. There we go. And see, that wasn't so bad, but it's still so bulky. You know, it's hard to even see what I'm doing here with all the stuff in the arm of the machine plus the ruler. So just understand it's not easy, but it is possible to have the ruler in the arm of the machine. Okay, so now I need to stitch back, and this is this is really tricky. I'm bending over slightly so that way I can see how I've lined up the foot and the ruler. Again, I'm doing my 1/4 inch spacing here. Shift the ruler just a little bit. It was getting a little bit too narrow right there. There we go. So that's my 1/4 inch spacing. I only stitch it over a little bit. Now I'll stitch over a full 1/2 inch. So if you want to think in terms of like, okay, you're stitching over a 1/2 inch or you're stitching over until the edge of the foot is a 1/4 inch from the line you just stitched. Whichever way visibly, you know, whether the visible looking at it works for you or just the math of it works for you, it's totally however it works for your brain, right? Okay, there we go. We got through the hard part. I can move the ruler to my other hand. I'm going to stitch on down. And you can see that effect. That looks cool. So just crossing that over, doubling it up, we're creating a matrix effect, but because of the spaced lines, you know how we double spaced here and have lines a little bit closer together, it creates a pinstripe matrix effect. I absolutely love it. Matrix is one of my favorite designs. It's basically just a wiggly grid, but it is so useful. And it's so pretty, and then I think Pinstripe Matrix just adds this really nice formality. It's very elegant. I picked a lot of elegant designs for this quilt along. You know, a lot of these designs I would use on a whole cloth quilt, and if you think about it, that's exactly what Dream Big Panel is. Dream Big Panel is a whole cloth. You know, it's a great big giant printed flower, but it's still one piece of fabric basted up with batting and backing. That's a whole cloth. And so the choice of designs, going to designs like Matrix, you know, Pinstripe Matrix and grid lines. We're going to learn chain of pearls later on. All of these designs stand out beautifully. They're very elegant. They have a great effect on the quilt. Okay, so now I'm going to shift again. This time, as I'm stitching away, because of the way everything lined up, I'm now doing my wider spacing as I pull the quilt towards myself, and then I'm doing the narrower spacing as I stitch the opposite direction. So it's really funny how sometimes something feels more difficult. I usually find, you know, that where I can't see the ruler because it's back here kind of behind the machine, I find that just a little bit more of a struggle, but I find it easier whenever I am on the wider spacing versus whenever I'm stitching the narrower spacing. I find this easier when I am stitching towards myself. So pick up on little things like that. You never know how something's going to feel until you actually start quilting it, until you actually get it on your machine. And it was really funny. The other day I was thinking about it and I realized this is the biggest quilt that I've done entirely with rulers on my home machine. I've definitely done rulers on my long arms a lot more than I've done on my home sewing machine. So this has been such a good skill builder for ruler quilting, and I feel so much more confident with it now and more understanding of what it's good at on a home sewing machine. So as I said, I like to do my little bit of travel stitching just up and down the sides. I just think that builds it up, makes it look so nice. Again, might have to do some couching. Although Josh is like, how much time do you want to put into that jacket? I know, it's kind of crazy, but it's so much fun. It's so nice to have something pretty to wear. All right, so that narrower spacing is, I just find that those lines are just so much quicker. And it might be because visibly you can see better. Like, so here, I'm lining up the etched line on my ruler. So I'm looking through the ruler onto those etched lines. Versus when you're lining up right on the edge of the ruler, you can't really see the stitching line and you can't really see the edge of the ruler. It's kind of a blind edge. And it's right here where, it's just visibly, it's just more difficult. But when I have it shifted over, I think this is the reason why it's easier. I'm looking at the etched line, I can see it, and I can see my stitching line. So it's not lining up, I immediately spot it. So there we go. I think that might be why it feels easier. And I think every single petal is going to be a learning experience. And this is the great thing about stitching the same designs over and over again. And the reason why I only put 8 designs in Dream Big, because of course we have all of these gorgeous petals. You could stitch a different design in every single petal. That's absolutely open to you, by the way. You absolutely can do that if you want to. But overall, I just find that that can be very cluttered. It can be very busy. And oftentimes you don't gain very much practice stitching only one petal with the design, only having one experience with the design. By stitching a design and having it multiple times, multiple places, and it also in multiple areas where not just right here in the center of the quilt, you also can experience it stitching closer to the edges. All of that is great practice, and each time you're going to be learning more. You're going to be getting a hold of more nuances of little things, little tiny, tiny things. Like I said, getting more information into your fingertips. That only comes from personal experience and practice. So I'm finishing up here. I think I have room for one more line, maybe 2. And you can see once you get the ruler to where you're stitching in that left to right direction so that the ruler can stay in your left hand the whole time, it really is faster. Because you're also, the other nice thing about it is you're pulling the quilt out of the arm of the machine. So instead of building up more and packing up more fabric here in the arm of the machine, you're reducing it. You're taking more out. I really like that. Very good effect. And also understand that you can mix and match these rulers too. So if you wanted to, you could go and stitch with the super slide ruler going in one direction, and then you could switch to the mini slide ruler going in the opposite direction. Definitely mix it up and just experiment with it. I gotta say, I typically, even though it's bigger ruler, I typically grab the super slide because it's long enough to be able to stitch most of these petals, even the biggest petals, all the way across. And then whenever it did get awkward, I was able to easily just turn it around and be able to get more space. That's just how the ruler is designed. So very, very easy overall. Now, again, I'm in that situation and I can definitely say right now, this is harder. And what it is I'm lining up the edge of the ruler with the line of stitching I just stitched. And because I can't see the edge of the ruler and I can't see, because it's right on top of that line of stitching, I can't quite see that line of stitching either. This is a struggle. So what do you do in that situation if you just really don't like it, doesn't feel right, can't see? Well, travel stitch. What you're going to do is instead of stitching backwards and staying with that, the way it's a pattern, stitching backwards in that narrow spacing and then stitching forwards on that wider spacing. That's just the pattern that was established from the beginning. Well, you can mix that up by travel stitching all the way around to the top of that line. And so now I'm going to be coming down towards me with the narrow spacing, and then I'll be stitching away from myself with the wider spacing. So here I can put my foot down because I'm super comfortable, super confident, and that is so much easier. I can actually see what I'm doing. Now stitch over, 1/2 inch. Now I can line up that ruler, even though it's behind the machine, even though it's hard to see, I can line up that ruler so much better with that etched line because I can really see it. There we go, and I've got space for one more line, just like so. So this is just another example, guys, of where I'm learning right along with you, because I wouldn't have been able to know, hey, there's actually a direction to stitch in that feels better for these particular lines. When you have that narrow spacing, you're using that edge of your ruler to line up with the line of stitching from before. It's visibly difficult to see. And so by just doing that little bit of travel stitching and starting the line from a different angle, that helped enormously. So I hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt Pinstripe Matrix. You can use your super slide or mini slide rulers. You can also mix and match them, so stitch mini slide through one side of the lines and super slide through the other side of the lines, and really see all the different effects that these rulers can create. So that's it for this video. I hope you're excited about giving this design a try. If you'd like to know exactly where I stitched this design on the Dream Big quilt, come and check out the Dream Big Guidebook, available at leahday.com/dreamguide. I share step-by-step diagrams for which designs I stitch in which areas on the quilt, as well as extra helpful tips and tricks for getting started, and more instructions on what I'm doing with my Dream Big quilts. I'm going to be cutting these up and turning them into a quilted jacket. So if you'd like extra information, some tips and tricks and behind the scenes information, come and check out that guidebook at leahday.com/dreamguide. Until next time, let's go quilt.